morning, everybody. Good evening, wherever you may be. And thank you for joining us today. We're very happy to have Matthew today joining us live from Dharamsala. And he's a famous scholar. I first heard of Matthew from Roberto Vitali in Dharamsala singing his praises as one of the best translators. This was almost 20 years ago now. And so it's a pleasure to welcome him today. And Matthew's working with Khyentse Vision Project, and we were just discussing his work. And I know him for this wonderful book, Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo's Guide to Central Tibet, which many of you might be familiar with. And this is the topic of today's talk. So very much looking forward to it. And the talk will last about an hour. And then if you have any questions, you can ask them directly to Matthew or write them in the chat. So without further ado, thank you, Matthew, and welcome, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to speak. And thanks, everyone, for coming. So we'll get straight into it. In order to start talking about the guide, I'm going to locate it, first of all, in terms of who the author was and his travels, which led to the writing of this guidebook. And so to do that, I'm going to share a few images. I'll just share the screen here. I hope you can see that. So Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo, indeed a daunting figure, a giant among the masters of his day, a master of whom in the Tibetan idiom we say, you need courage even to speak his name. So impressive is his realization and his mastery of all aspects of the Buddha Dharma. The biography of Khyentse Wangpo is divided in the traditional way into outer, inner, and secret aspects of his life. This is just the briefest introduction that I can manage. So the outer biography, which concerns his visible lifetime and achievements, basically deals with his mastery of the entirety of the Buddhist teachings, especially the Vajrayana, and shows how it's rooted in his long spiritual ancestry, because the list of his previous rebirths, almost all of whom are very famous and illustrious Buddhist masters of Tibet, and before that, India. I don't know, there's more than 50 names anyway in the biography of his antecedents, and he is said to have sought out and sought the teachings and studied with 150 human masters in his present lifetime. Not quite that many recorded in the biography, but dozens and dozens of great masters, and their teachings are all listed there, the teachings that he received from them. And it deals with his activity as a lama of lamas, a supreme figure in his world, a scholar and a great visionary and a statesman. The inner biography is sort of phrased in such a way as it's about how he received transmissions of what are called the 8 great chariots, the Shintai Chimpo Gye, which is how he and his contemporaries conceived of the Tibetan Vajrayana tradition. Here we can see an image. This is a mural painting at Zhongshan Monastery, which shows how he received, mostly in visions, the transmissions of each of these 8 great traditions of the Vajrayana heritage that was introduced to Tibet from India. I'll talk a little bit more about that because it's relevant to how the guide is also structured. But the idea of Shintai Chimpo Gye is a kind of very conscious reaction to the typical categorization of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition as 4 great schools, right? That you're all familiar with. The Khyentse and his contemporaries, and this goes back much further actually in Tibetan history to generally a sort of non-sectarian view of the tradition, identifies 8 traditions of the authentic Vajrayana teachings, which were transferred by human lineage, Indian master to Tibetan master and Tibetan master to their successive disciples and so on through the 8 of them, which are all considered to be equally valid paths to liberation. So this is just another way of sort of breaking down and presenting the tradition in a scheme which is not overtly political, like or to do with social and political factors which created the 4 great schools that most people know. So the background to this is what's commonly known as the Rimé movement or the sectarian movement, which was very concerned with reviving extinct or neglected traditions, because some of these 8 traditions, had been either incorporated and adulterated by some of the larger schools, or they've just been neglected and withered away altogether. So restoring those and re-establishing the transmission lineages, writing down the literature where possible, most of which Khyentse did through his own visionary powers. Right, so that's the stature of the master that we're talking about. He revived many of these transmissions. He mastered all of them, without exception, and introduced some new ones of his own, through his own revelations, which brings to the secret biography. The last section of the biography is his secret life, which basically deals with his mastery of the Dharma tradition, the revealed teachings, of which he had extraordinary knowledge. And a lot of his revelations are actually what's called in the language of the tradition Yangter, re-revealed teachings. These are, in many cases, when a historic Tibetan revealed a Dharma and the circumstances were not right or favorable, or something happened, something went wrong, it often does, there are obstacles and so on, the Tibetan would reconceal it, which is to re-entrust it to the Dakinis. And such was Khyentse's grasp. His previous life experiences and his spiritual accomplishment was such that he was capable of re-revealing these reconcealed treasures in visions. Very, very large numbers of treasure teachings which had been lost or become obscure were re-revealed, their transmissions revived, their texts, sadhanas, rituals, and so on written down. And that actually makes up the collection of his Yangter, re-revealed Yangter, makes up a large part of the collection called the Rinchen Tenzu, which is the definitive collection of Dharma teachings in the Tibetan tradition. So that is the strength of his relationship with the Dharma tradition. So in order to locate the guide in all of this, we go back to his early career. And yeah, so as most of you probably know, Khyentse Wangpo came from Dege. This is a rare photo, fairly rare photo of Dege Genshe, which is the main monastery and palace complex, the palace of the Dege kings in eastern Tibet. And in Khyentse's day, Dege was and had been for the century previously the largest, the most powerful, and the most culturally rich and accomplished of the Kham kingdoms. That's the milieu into which he was born. And he was born into the Dege aristocracy. His father was a secretary, a senior ranking figure in the palace, and a highly educated person. And he was recognized at a very young age as a reincarnation of one of the abbots of Ngor. So this needs a little bit of explanation. Really, since the rise of the Dege kingdom in the 17th century, one of the main alliances and linkages that they made was with the monastery of the Sakyapa monastery of Ngor in central Tibet. The lamas of Ngor became gurus to the kings of Dege and accepted their patronage. And so a tradition was started where it was standard, normal for retiring abbots of Ngor to visit Dege and to spend years of their life there teaching and serving the king and so on, like that. And this is a history with which Khyentse was very familiar and has written about. But his immediate circumstances in this life was against that background. So he was recognized as the reincarnation of the abbot of Tatse Labra. Tatse is the older, the most distinguished of the Lama palaces at Ngor Monastery. Tatse Nankachime was the throne holder of Ngor and of Tadse Labang, who came to Dege towards the end of his life and passed away there in the same year that Khyentse was born. And his nephews swiftly traveled to Dege subsequently and recognized him as the Tadse Shabdrung, the successor to their uncle. And the biography unusually, frankly, records that Khyentse's father wasn't very happy about this, wasn't very keen on him being taken away as a young child, kept him at home. But eventually, by the time he was 19 or 20, he made the journey to Ngor. This was in 1840. He arrived. This was traveling between Dege and Ngor in those days was a journey of at least a month, probably more, on horseback. And started his studies at Ngor, and the two nephews of his previous incarnation were his main tutors at Ngor, and they obviously had big plans for him to become the abbot of Tadse and to spend the rest of his life being, an established and privileged Tulku Lama abbot at Ngor Monastery. He wasn't having any of this. The biography records that not very long after arriving, he declined to take his Nyenzo, his higher bhikshu ordination vows at Ngor. Instead, he traveled to Mindraling entirely on his own initiative and took his vows there. And that was the start of his travels around central Tibet. He was only 20, 21 at that time. He started from Mindraling itself, started traveling through southern Tibet on a pilgrimage of vast scope, not in the style that befitted his rank in those days. If you were an incarnate Lama going on pilgrimage, you would have an entourage of pack animals and servants and guides and so on. And it wouldn't be such a hardship to make a trip like that. But Khyentse went just with one companion, which was his attendant, a Kampa layman, who's recorded in the biography. His name was Sutrang Gyatso, and walked on most of his pilgrimage. It is recorded for months and months, guided by his past life experiences and his scholarly learning. And his objective was, apart from pilgrimage itself, was to seek out the places of origin, particularly of the 8 traditions that I mentioned earlier, because most of them started in central Tibet. And for a learned, Lama from Eastern Tibet who's been educated deeply in the tradition, all of these names were very familiar. The seats of the original masters of those traditions and so on were kind of legendary. He wanted to find them, but many of them were no longer in such a good shape. But that's just sort of setting the scene. In the first trip, which took place between 1840 and 1843, he traveled, as I said, started traveling through southern Tibet. He went down through Lodrak all the way into Bhutan, as far as Bumthang, and back again. This is an ambitious journey for 2 people traveling on foot, to say the least, and visited amazing places along the way, which are recorded in the guide. And on his second journey, which so in 1843, after finishing the first stint at Ngor, his teacher, one of the nephews of his previous incarnation, had just resigned as the abbot of Ngor, and was invited, of course, as a matter of course, to visit Dege. This is Ngor Monastery, by the way. The rare old photo. Ngor Monastery was entirely destroyed. Not a single building left. So this is quite a valuable photo, just to give you an impression. Tadse Labang is the building right at the top. Yeah. So Khyentse accompanied his teacher back to Dege in 1843, and then studied under him back at his home monastery in Dzongsa for a few years, and then they both returned in 1848, and that was his second stint in central Tibet. At that time, he went to Sakya in particular, and places in Tsang, and met many of his major teachers. Went around looking for all the people that he wanted to study with. Many of them were famous and very accomplished masters, and sat at their feet and received their teachings. Over a 3-year period, in 1851, he returned to Dege and spent the rest of his life there, or at least in Kham. Didn't travel very much after that. So it was sort of 6-year period of 6 years in the 1840s that he spent in central Tibet. And the transmissions and the blessings and the visions, as I mentioned, from the masters of the 8 great chariots, many of them were received at the places that he visited in central Tibet during those years. So, it's a very formative period in his career. I'll just show some examples. This is sort of random examples. This is Mugulung, not far from Sakya, the place where Panchen Gayadhara taught the Lamdre transmission to Lama Drongmi, which is, the seminal really event in the creation of the Sakyapa tradition. There are 13 caves in that rock face, some of them with temples built around them. By the time Khyentse came along in the 19th century, this was a very neglected and not very well populated hermitage, which only people familiar with the history of the tradition would know about in detail. And Khyentse was obviously one of those people. And so this is one of many places in the biography which records that he had visionary transmission, in this case from Drongmi. Drongmi appeared to him in the cave in Mugulung and gave him a transmission of the Lamdre teachings. This is just an example. There are many examples of these kind of experiences that he had in central Tibet. Here's another one. I'm showing this particularly because this is an extremely rare survival. So much of Tibet's material heritage, as we know, was destroyed, and the contents of all the monasteries was destroyed. This is a very rare survival. This is a statue of Shechen Lose Gyatso. Within the Sakyapa tradition, Shechen was the 16th century founder of a sort of esoteric branch of the Sakyapa tradition, was of particular importance to Khyentse and his predecessors, his gurus and their gurus in the Sakyapa tradition. And the statue was famous for being lifelike. People with, the connection or the karma on beholding the statue would see its face move, or see unusual things, or would find rinse relics appearing in their hand or in its hand, or there are various stories like this. It doesn't go into detail in Khyentse's works, but it says that he had visions like that. When he visited this statue, it appeared to him as the master himself, a living being. And miraculously, this statue was, it's big, it's almost life size, and it's made in this very heavy black clay that they have in that area of town, was hidden and survived the Cultural Revolution, which is absolutely extraordinary. So that's why I'm showing it. This is an example. This place is called Zara in the Uyuk Valley. This is a place where Khyentse was riding down here, riding past this valley on a horseback, coming down the Uyuk Valley, and suddenly had a vision which recalled his previous life as Chetsun Sengye Wangchu, Dzogchen master in Vimala Mitra's tradition. And he recognized this place, this spot, it's a cave, the temple is built in a cave, as the place where Chetsun accomplished the teachings and dissolved his body into light. That, this is a famous feat which is recorded in the Dzogchen literature. So Khyentse was actually able to identify the location where that took place, which had not been identified before. And subsequently, his disciples built a temple there. So this is an example of a pilgrimage, what is now a pilgrimage destination in central Tibet, which was originated by him. Can we have more? Yeah, and then finally, there's another example. This is the summit of Churi mountain in central Tibet. This is where the Lhasa Valley meets the big Tsangpo Valley. It's a very spectacular spot. It's a holy mountain, going back, to the origins of Buddhism in Tibet. But particularly this cave hermitage on the summit is associated with Guru Rinpoche. So there's a passage in the biography where Khyentse received some kind of message or sign that he should go to the summit of this mountain to perform rituals for the well-being of the land of Tibet. This is in 1850 something, 1850 or 51 probably. And it records that he did so. And while he was performing those rituals on the summit of the mountain, he had a vision of the Guru surrounded by clouds of dakinis and so on, approaching him through the sky. And sort of granting him assurance that yes, his prayers had been answered and that there would be peace and well-being in central Tibet for the next 12 years. So these are extraordinary visions, by even by his standards. And so these, I'm just illustrating them with photos. There are many more. I'm not going to try and go through them in any detail, but I'll just leave that there for the moment. So getting onto the guide itself, I've probably said, or it's been written in blurbs about the book or something, that this was the first proper pilgrimage guide in Tibetan literature. It's a bit risky to say that because so much of Tibetan literature has been lost. And we can't really be sure about things like that. But there are no signs of anything of the kind preceding it. It's the only one of its which is wide-ranging, as covering an entire territory like Lutsan, the whole of central Tibet, systematically, which is on a non-sectarian basis, covering all the traditions sort of even-handedly, and which is portable, and is structured actually as a travel itinerary. It speaks to the reader as if they're holding it in their hand and walking through the territory. There's nothing like that we know of in traditional literature. Traditional literature, very often the work, the piece of writing that would be associated with a temple or a holy place, is called a kachak, which means like an inventory, a list, which is limited to one location. In almost all cases, a kachak just deals with one site, one building, very often in some cases just one statue. And it's written and conceived within the tradition that place or statue belonged to, and that narrative, and would usually have been read in situ, like the pilgrim would ask the temple keeper, is there a kachak, if they were a literate person, if they took an interest, and they would be shown it there and, would read it there. So Khyentse's guide in that sense is sort of much more like a travel guide in the modern genre that we're familiar with than anything else that there is really before. I mean, since then there have been a few works. I'll get onto that later, sort of emulating it. But this is the only surviving work which is written in that style. And part of well, since I've been doing this translation work for the Khyentse Vision Project in the last few years, the most significant historical work to be translated is called a Denrab. It's by far the most serious historical work that he wrote. It's just over 100 folios in Tibetan traditional format, which is substantial. And again, it's the title describes it as a denrab, but traditionally a denrab, it refers only to one institution. A denrab means the succession of abbots or lamas of a particular lineage, or it's usually an institution, the successive abbots, and so on. A denrab would list them, their names and their dates and their accomplishments and so on, as well as some kind of background history of the monastery. Khyentse's denrab covers the entirety of Tibetan Buddhism, sect by sect, school by school, in considerable detail, geographical detail, historical detail, showing vast learning and familiarity. And with this kind of even-handed, non-sectarian approach, which, basically is much more familiar to us as modern readers than the idiom in which traditional Tibetan works of this kind were written. So the Denrab is a very interesting comparison to the guide, because they're both kind of bending traditional genres with this extraordinarily erudite, but also sort of fresh and somehow very lucid and rational approach to the tradition, and presenting it in a very systematic and clear way. So I've argued, I suggest in the book, that this is really a product of the Rime outlook. the Rime tradition is obviously concerned mainly with Vajrayana, is dealing with extraordinarily esoteric subjects, but it does have this kind of very methodical and quite modernist approach to the recording of data and the structuring of its presentation. And I take this guidebook as a good example of that, even though it's such a minor work on such a relatively minor subject. So it privileges the original seats of the traditions and the hermitages of the great masters who founded them, rather than concentrating on the great monastic institutions, which are so famous in Tibet, or indeed natural sites like holy mountains and lakes and so on. These are not emphasized. The guide is very much concerned with finding, however humble, however neglected, lost, buried these days, the places where the original transmissions and the schools were originally developed and born from the works and the lives of the great founding masters. So that's what it's really concerned with. It's untypical of his other compositions. Khyentse's, I mean, we're working on his collected works. There are 24 volumes. I don't want to say that he wasn't a voluminous writer, but writing wasn't really his thing. All the great works that we're familiar with in the Rime tradition were written down by Khyentse, right? His lifelong collaborator, extraordinary scholar and master, but one who looked to Khyentse for inspiration. But Khyentse was the one who wrote down these, the 5 great treasuries, which run to thousands of pages. With Khyentse's inspiration, that's a very brief kind of nutshell characterization of their relationship. Khyentse's own works, where we have complete works, they tend to be very ornate, very poetic. For instance, recently I've been working on exactly a kachak of a statue. This is a very traditional genre. And is written in a style where, a sentence goes on for several pages because it's so full of effusive praise and poetic ornamentation and so on. So this is the kind of style that he wrote in, absolutely different from what we find in the guide, which is very short and very straightforward. And as far as we can tell, I've also suggested this in the book, we have a reference in Khyentse's autobiography, which is also a very informative work. When Khyentse was visiting central Tibet in the late 1850s, it mentions in his autobiography that he went to Khyentse, who he, always refers to very deferentially as, the Lord Guru, his great master and so on, and asked him for tips, because he must know his travels were so famous. Everybody knew that he'd traveled so extensively and become very familiar with the landscape of central Tibet. Khyentse himself went and requested Khyentse to give him tips about, what are the important places to visit on pilgrimage in central Tibet. My guess is that that was the origin of the guide, although, this is not recorded or written anywhere, but that's the closest tip that we have. So there's, it just begins bang without any ornamental or beating around the bush or any poetry or anything like that. And it is written in all very ordinary language, as I say, as an itinerary telling you, you go here and from there you can go to here. And then in this way, as a manual, not really as a work of religious devotion or scholarship, although the contents are, betray an extraordinary learning and familiarity with the subject matter. So that's what we know about how the guide was created. I just want to put it in historical context a little bit for people today to realize this, but the significance of Utsang, central Tibet, to these people, the Rime masters in 18th, 19th century Eastern Tibet, mainly Kham, was basically, that it was a holy land which was now lost in the obscurity of the degeneration, mainly political, and also environmental degeneration, of the last century or two. By the 18th century, I'm assuming, a little bit of knowledge of the contours of Tibetan history by now at this point. But by the 18th century, Central Tibet was no longer the center of religious and cultural life in Tibet that it had been, previously. The extraordinary violence of the Civil War, which went on through the 16th century and the first half of the 17th, between the two provinces of Central Tibet. And then all of the trouble that had been incurred by involving Mongol forces, the Mongol armies of the different Mongol tribes being the most influential, powerful forces in Central Asia at that time, were involved in the melee. All of this caused untold destruction. And by the 18th century, Lhasa had been implicated in this power struggle, which ended up being a power struggle between the Qing Empire and the last great militarily powerful faction of the Mongols, the Dzungar, from Western Mongolia. All of the outcome of all of that was that by the time the Dzungars were defeated and the Qing established, effective, although distant and loose control over Central Tibet, the Lhasa government, the Ganden Pochang state, founded by the fifth Dalai Lama, had become essentially a stultified theocracy, in which the Central Tibetan elites accepted. We hear a lot about Tibetan resistance and opposition to Chinese dominance and so on, but there was a coalition of interest between Central Tibetan elites and the pro-Buddhist Progilukpa court of the Qing emperors of that time, Qianlong especially, in the face of British colonial inroads in India. That was the scenario at the time. The fear, which was felt by obviously many Asian countries and kingdoms at that time, of the depredations of British and French colonialism, were what cemented the isolation and the stultification of the Tibetan tradition and its kind of indebtedness to Qing protection. So this is a sort of very short and inadequate summary of the background to all of these things. But what's important to understand is that the center of gravity in terms of religious and cultural life, the center of gravity had shifted long since from Central Tibet to Kham. And the Rime movement, as we call it, this non-sectarian movement, had really is associated nowadays. I mean, we talk about the Rime movement, we talk about Khyentse Wangpo, Kongshu, and a third figure, the great Terten Chogyal Lingpa. These three were regarded as the great trio masters of the non-sectarian movement, who were active basically during the third quarter of the 19th century in Kham. But the movement and the outlook that it represented goes back a little bit further, particularly to it's not supposed to be there. Particularly to this figure, Situ Penchen, the great historic master of the Dege kingdom, guru of King Tempet Sering, the founder of the Dege Pakam. Situ Penchen is another giant figure, and he and his great contemporaries, Kato Rinzin, Shechen Rinzin, great masters of Dege through the mid-18th century, had begun, really initiated this interest in reviving dead traditions. The most well-known is in the biographies of both Situ Penchen and Katok Situ. We see them traveling to Central Tibet, spending a lot of time there, taking a particular interest in the revival of the Jonangpa tradition, trying to get the transmissions from the surviving Jonangpa masters, collect their literature and so on, because the Jonang school had been outlawed, right? In the Civil War period after the ascension of Ganden Pochang, Jonang school was identified as a political enemy or opponent force, and it was suppressed. The monastery was converted to the Gelugpa school and so on and so forth. So that kind of concern that Situ Penchen showed for revising And he collected transmissions, for example, in central Tibet and reintroduced them to the survivors of the Jamyang tradition in Kham. So this kind of activity, right, is what we have to understand as the antecedents of the Rime activity of Khyentse Wangpo. And also this concern with what are called the Rigme, the ten Vidyasthana. In Tibetan tradition, you have these disciplines, they're called sciences or branches of learning. They're particularly the linguistic and grammatical arts, poetry, and so on, all derived from the Sanskrit tradition, but also medicine, Tibetan medicine, and the arts, painting, sculpture, and so on, all of which Situ Penchen was an extraordinary master in all of these disciplines. You know, it's almost hard to sort of, for us to imagine now, someone so vastly and widely accomplished. But this also comes back to, you know, a lot of the concerns that we see in Khyentse's life and times and the trajectory of his career. So this is all by way of trying to explain what Central Tibet represented to people from this milieu, right? So there's one example that I'll pick, is one of Khyentse's teachers, Shechen. Actually, he's one of his main teachers in Sanskrit grammar. He came from Shechen Monastery in Dekit. In 1826, he was traveling in central Tibet. He came upon a small temple outside Lhasa where fabulous relics of ancient Indian masters were preserved in apparent obscurity. These things included the purba of Guru Rinpoche, the conch trumpet of Naropa, the sandalwood trident of Kukuripa, and his biography, Shechen Ontra's biography, records that he was astonished to find these things languishing in obscurity with apparently no one knowing about it or caring about it. These same sentiments we find expressed in Khyentse's guide. Many of the entries, the short descriptions of places that he gives, he makes some kind of lamenting comment that, you know, nowadays, the place has been taken over by married monks, or there's just a caretaker, or it's fallen into obscurity, you know, these kind of things. So this is very much the atmosphere in which the guide was written. Just by way of background, the small temple near Lhasa that is mentioned in Intra's biography is called a place called Ngodutse, where there was an ancient lineage of mantrika astrologers who were popularly known as Seson. They had the duty of protecting the crops from hail in summertime using mantra and ritual. And they were so successful in this that they had won the patronage of the Ganden Potrang state itself, the Tibetan government. They were official, you know, astrologers, mantrika, and Seson hail protectors, you know, to the government itself. And it's because of that's the reason that all these fabulous treasures that we just mentioned came into their possession, because they had previously been in the possession of the Nangse Depa. Before the establishment of Ganden Potrang, the Nangse Depa were one of the powers that were in Lhasa, and they were implacably opposed to the rise of the Gelugpa school, and they lost out very heavily when the Ganden Potrang state was established. And in typical Tibetan style, their fabulous collection of relics was dispossessed and given to someone else. These are the kind of details, you know, that would have been very familiar to Khyentse and other masters, but you know, get passed over in the rather eulogistic, hagiographic retelling of Tibetan history. But that's just a chance example that comes up. Let me move on. So, but yeah, my point there is that Khyentse was not the first Eastern master to tour central Tibet in this period, looking for traces of antiquity. And the tone that you find of lamenting the degeneration of the sacred places and the moral corruption of the monastic state of the authorities in Lhasa is to be found, you know, generally among his contemporaries as well. So all of these are reasons why I chose the guide as a framework for a review of Central Tibet's heritage in the post-Mao Zedong era, in which, you know, it was all lying in ruins. And that's how this book began. The project was really made possible by another book by Khyentse's nephew, this Lama. He's the Katok Situ, the third Katok Situ incarnation, Chökyi Gyatso. who traveled in central Tibet from 1918 to 1920, roughly, on a similar quest. But he, fortunately for us, wrote down all the details as a diary, travel diary. And it's considerably longer. Khyentse's guide is 18 folios, by the way, in the traditional Tibetan format. Sita's guide is nearly 300 folios, and it includes detailed descriptions of contents of many of the monasteries and temples that he visited, without which we would be at pains, to reconstruct them now. So it's an extraordinarily important work, and it really facilitated the writing of this guide in an age when everything has been destroyed. This is from the tanka that I showed, the first slide, actually. This shows Katok Situ sitting at Khyentse's feet. So that's the most important, but I'm not the first person to translate Khyentse's guide. This was done in the 1950s. Because of its unique character and the amount of information that it has about sort of history and geography and so on, it attracted the attention of some of the Western pioneers, particularly Professor Giuseppe Tucci in Rome, and he got one of his students, I should say, to translate it into English. This was published, as you can see, in 1958. Alfonso Ferrari was an Italian lady who had never left Italy, apparently, certainly hadn't visited Tibet. And she was helped in compiling this work by Tucci's main disciple, one of his main disciples, Luciano Pepe, the historian, and also by Hugh Richardson, who had recently returned, the former British resident in Lhasa, who had spent 9 years in Lhasa with a camera and ability to travel. So his photographs illustrate the first edition of the translation, but these, between these people, they didn't really have so many sources to tackle the subject. They didn't have so many literary sources that we have now, and they had obviously limited access to the territory. So, it's also struck me as appropriate to update and retranslate and represent the work in English. Another little update which I might add, the one source which I didn't have when I wrote the book is the travel diary of Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo, right, the principal reincarnation of Khyentse Wangpo, who had the prescience to leave Dege in 1955, sensing probably what was about to happen, came to Lhasa, attempted to persuade the Dalai Lama and others of the danger which they were facing, didn't have much success, spent several months traveling around on pilgrimage in central Tibet, but particularly making offerings, presenting generous offerings to many of the monastic assemblies, and then quietly slipped away into Sikkim shortly before the fall of Lhasa in 1959, well, actually a couple of years before. So I had heard that he wrote a travel diary and was not able to locate it. Since I published the guide, it has been located, but as I suspected and others suspected, it's not very informative. It's written in the traditional style. It lists, the number of tea bricks and butter packs and so on that he donated, but it doesn't tell, much about his travels or the places that he visited. So that's a bit disappointing, but it is available now. It has been published. So that brings us to the 20th century. I'll just recap as quickly as possible. In March 1959, after the Lhasa uprising was defeated by the People's Liberation Army and the Dalai Lama and his court fled to India, all of the temples and monasteries were expropriated by the Chinese government. They were emptied of their contents and of their popular monastic communities. And many of them, most of the contents were destroyed, or at least stolen. There was a slight respite after that in 1961, 2 years later, which coincided with there was a slight revision at the top of the Chinese government due to the disastrous failures of the Great Leap Forward when Mao Zedong was obliged to sort of step back by the other members of the supposedly collective leadership, and a couple of them, Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi in particular, attempted to sort of right some of the damage which had been done in the previous years when Mao had launched, what is now regarded as the biggest famine in history. So at that time, the State Council in Beijing drew up a list of protected monuments because they didn't want everything to be destroyed, and that included, a minimum of Tibetan monuments. 13, I think there are listed in the statute. Which explains why during the Cultural Revolution, which broke out soon after this episode, Mao returned to power very soon afterwards, and a couple of years later launched the Cultural Revolution, which, as we know, was extraordinarily destructive of heritage everywhere, but especially in Tibet. But that's why a few iconic buildings, the Potala Palace in Lhasa, Pershi Lumpo in Shiketse, Khyentse, the Hlakang Chenmo in Sakya, the buildings themselves survived, right? And it's because of that. Otherwise, probably they would all have been lost. So yeah, then the Cultural Revolution during the period 1966 to 1970, extraordinary violence, destroying the physical structures of buildings that had already been desecrated and deprived of their contents. That was basically over by about 1969, 1970. The country lay in complete ruins. In 1979, the new order, the new dispensation was launched. Deng Xiaoping, reviled by Mao, had come back to power and launched a less ideological version of socialism in China, a new constitution. And the new constitution reestablished the freedom to believe in religion, which therefore allowed the rebuilding of some of these destroyed monuments to start to happen. Dandin was the first one in central Tibet, started in 1980. And from that point on, most places attempted in some order or other to reestablish their local monastery or temple, historic one that had been destroyed. So the field work for Khyentse's guide started in the early 1990s. That was, in fact, just after martial law was lifted. Okay, so there were a series of protests which changed the equation in occupied Tibet in the late 1980s, from 87 through 89. Popular nationalist protests led mainly by Tibetan monks took place in Lhasa and were crushed. Martial law was introduced in Lhasa before it was introduced in Beijing in response to the Tiananmen protests. And it was lifted in end of 1990, I think, through 1991. So at that time is when I started. And as a result, the official reaction to those protests was basically to reshape, reconsider and reconstitute Tibet policy, which had been liberalized. The period since 1979, the new constitution and so on, had been characterized as a liberalization. That liberalization was now terminated in pretty short order after the protests that had taken place. And there were 2 points to the new policy direction. One was political repression and the crushing of dissent. The other one was rapid order urbanization and the construction of infrastructure. The liberalization was rolled back, but the freedom to believe in religion was maintained. In fact, it has been maintained until this day. The Communist Party, despite its general outlook, has not been prepared to give that up. So and it's still very proud in claims whenever there's criticism and so on that it allows freedom of religion. So the rebuilding of monuments continued through this period. So urbanization meant really radical, rapid physical transformation of the landscape. the construction of infrastructure, and the development of the urban areas, which were minimal. You know, in Tibet basically doesn't have, traditionally had no urban area. Even Lhasa wouldn't really qualify as a town, hardly qualify as a town by global standards. So that began to change very quickly with the help, as everywhere in the world, of concrete. So this is, here you can see the demolition that was taking place at that time of the old city of Lhasa. This is taken in Lhasa, Bakor at that time. This was the site of the old Sokang house. Sokang, one of the great noble families of central Tibet. Their house was demolished and replaced by a concrete frame supermarket. But you can see there's a little sign there saying that we kept the Sakang. This is a Satsakang, which is sacred to Pandit Homa. It's one of the places where people stop when they're making the parkour and make offerings or salutations of some kind. So they didn't want to just demolish that, but, you know, built a multi-story supermarket around it. And Lhasa started, this is the main street, and Lhasa started to look like a Chinese city. That was the objective. And to be filled with this type of architecture. This is nothing compared to what's happened since, but this was already in the mid-1990s, you know, happening at a very fast pace and was quite shocking. There was, you know, it was like watching the transformation of the landscape in front of your eyes. So repression meant the determination to police the monasteries, control the monasteries, and restrict their influence on society, because monks had been identified as one of the major factors in opposition to the state in Tibet. So in 1994, a sort of historic decision was taken by the Communist Party to demonize the Dalai Lama, and demand that all Tibetan religious people and monastics condemn him and affirm their loyalty to the Chinese state. And the following year, 1995, they took the even more extraordinary step, in a sense, of recognizing their own candidate for the 11th Panchen Lama. 11th Panchen Lama had been, you know, very important figure. Don't have time to talk about him now, but he had led much of the activity of the restoration during the liberalization period in the 1980s and died quite suddenly in 1989. So the Chinese state took it upon itself to recognize his reincarnation and enforce its own recognition on the Tibetan population. And that involved a heavy program of re-education. Re-education in the monasteries. Work teams went into every monastery to tell people what they were supposed to think and get them to sign off on the government's point of view or be in a lot of trouble. So that was going on at exactly the time that I was visiting many of these monasteries, and in several cases I wasn't able, you know, to go into the monastery if the work team was there. I had to go back in some cases, you know, years and years later. So that was another part of the atmosphere at that time. But generally, the rebuilding was being done by people like this, the survivors of 1959, the people who, you know, with any education or influence, religious people, educated people, people with positions in the old social order. All of them had been, many of them had been killed. The ones who weren't killed were thrown into prison and spent 20 years in prison until 1979, 1980. And these were the people who came out in the 1980s and began to lead, you know, the reconstruction of local monasteries. And these were my key informants, the people that I wanted to find as, you know, before they disappeared, and interview them and get some kind of oral, you know, transmission from the past that they grew up in and could still remember to some extent. So in terms of the condition of the places in at that time in the mid-1990s, some were just unrestored ruins. And this is an example. This is Chuding Monastery in the Ern Valley. in Lhoka. Previously a middle-sized Gelugpa monastery, but probably because of its connections, historic connections to the Ganden Photrang government, there was no permission was given to restore it. As far as I know, it's still in that state today, but I haven't checked. This is Takla Kampo, the original monastery of the Kagyupa tradition in Takpo. You can see one little temple building has been restored in one corner of what used to be a great assembly hall. I think much more has been rebuilt there now, but at that time, that was either all that was permitted or all the resources that local people had to rebuild. This is another example. This is Chigyu Pemawe, which is a hermitage of the Sakya masters, about a day's walk behind Sakya in a remote valley, is a place where many illustrious masters of the Sakya tradition went to do retreat. And that's the state I found it in, probably in the late 1990s or early 2000s. Otherwise, some buildings were preserved, or at least not destroyed. Not just the listed ones that I mentioned, but in many cases, in the early stages of China's occupation, there was no infrastructure, right? There weren't any large buildings, and in some cases, it was considered necessary to keep these large, substantial, and very well-built structures to serve the state either as granaries or as government offices, or one thing or another. So this is one example. This is Jebumgang Monastery just outside Setang. Here, this is not the main, but what is now this is the Suklakanga Nindraling, what is now used as the main assembly hall. So you can see there, these are jeeps belonging to government officials who are working inside. The open veranda on the ground floor has been bricked up, and inside they turned the building into government offices. This is a picture from the early 1980s, I think, and this is the same building in 1992 after its renovation. So that's a fairly rare, successful example of a building structure survived and was sort of successfully restored. Obviously, most of the contents are still missing, but yeah, it sort of looks like something like what it used to look like. But very often, in the case of less important or more remote places, the restoration has only been symbolic. Didn't have much to do with the original building that was there before destruction. It was just done by local people because they felt they had to do something and with very little resources. But in other cases, oh, okay. Yeah, actually, I just threw this in because this is another example of an extraordinary survival. So this goes together with this buildings that weren't destroyed. This is Takham Keru, also in the Urn Valley, actually, in southern Tibet. And the statue in the temple hall there is definitely, the largest and most significant survival of an ancient statue anywhere in Tibet. This statue was commissioned by Trisong Detsen's mother, right? The Chinese prince of, sorry, not his mother. The Chinese wife of Trisong Detsen's father. In the 730s, she was a Chinese Buddhist princess, right? And she's recorded in the sources to have invited Khotanese monks to central Tibet. And this statue is considered to have been made in the Khotanese style. And we would have no way normally of comparing any statue of this caliber and size anywhere else that would have been destroyed. What happened in Tlakang Keru, somehow, we don't know the details, but local officials who were Tibetan managed to have the temple hall turned into a storage facility for salt. They filled the temple full of salt and closed it up, and it stayed closed all the way through the Cultural Revolution. So the statue was restored in extraordinary state of preservation. Sadly, there are very few examples like that, but I thought I'd just throw it in there. So otherwise, I was about to say, you also have state prestige reconstruction projects is another category. This is an old photo. This is taken by the German expedition in the 1930s. Samdrup Pochang, the palace of the Song kings, the erstwhile Song kings, which later became Zong, and palace on which famously the Potala itself is supposed to have been modeled, which was entirely destroyed in the course of China's occupation. But in the 2000s, they started to rebuild it like this. Okay, using concrete frame, no continuity with the previous architectural form or materials. And we're starting to see more and more of this type of reconstruction now. So do I still have time, or should I stop here, or should I talk a little bit more about my travels?
Do go ahead, Matthew. No mad rush to finish. Do go ahead, please. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so basically the changes that have taken place since the book was written and published is that the intensification of state control over the monasteries has increased by leaps and bounds to more really extreme state in which we find it now. Monasteries and religious practitioners, of all kinds, but especially monasteries. The other thing that has happened has been an explosion of domestic tourism in China. Chinese tourists were basically unheard of at the time that I was doing this work and traveling, up through the mid-2000s. Now the official figures that are given for domestic tourists visiting Tibet every year are multiple factors of the population of Tibet. Population of the TAR has increased to 3.5 million, much more than it was even 2 generations ago. And the numbers of tourists visiting, as alleged by the government, are in tens of millions. So that has had a big impact on the dynamics of rebuilding monasteries and branding them for tourists, and basically roping their inhabitants, the monks who are allowed to stay there, which are usually quite small numbers, basically being turned into ticket collectors and tour guides. So that all has become much more significant in the time since I was doing this work. So this is me walking in the footprints, of Jamyang Khyentse in the Sangpo Valley. In the background, you can see Jomokara, Holy Mountain, which is the border between Wu and Song. So how did I do it? We were never really allowed to travel independently. I should say foreign visitors were never really allowed to travel independently in central Tibet, or in most parts of Tibet. But we weren't strictly prevented either. So it was a matter of treading lightly and figuring out, what was possible, and how not to get into trouble, and how to upset as few people as possible, and so on. And this was an art that I learned over the years of doing this research. But clearly there are ethical issues around traveling in an occupied country. The approach I took was basically that I never took permits to visit any of the places. So the guide includes a list of something like 200 places, almost all of which I was able to visit over the course of 12, 15 years, in order to write this book. So I never took a permit. I never rented a vehicle, which is the way that you're supposed to travel as a foreigner. You're supposed to have a guide and a rented vehicle. So these days that vehicle is fitted with GPS surveillance, and everybody's kept under very tight wraps. So individual travel and research has become completely impossible in that sense. But I never did that. I decided that I wanted to go self-sufficient, and do it by walking and local transport, which at that time was trucks and what the Chinese call doulaiji, walking tractors, which was the only mechanized transport that most villages had. So I've traveled many hundreds of kilometers on both of those. And the way of doing this that I worked out basically was you need to be self-sufficient, which means carrying between 20 and 30 kilos of stuff on your back, right? Tent, stove, food, fuel, clothing, cameras, etc. Primarily because you don't want to put yourself in the position of being dependent on anyone for hospitality, because local Tibetan people can get in trouble for giving hospitality to unauthorized foreigners. So I did it that way. The other advantage of doing it that way is that when you arrive in a location, visiting a temple or monastery somewhere out in the countryside, and you arrive on foot, sweating with a big pack on your back, you are received differently than you would be if you had arrived in a Land Cruiser with a Chinese-speaking guide. And that helps. It helped, I found, to get people to open up and tell me the kinds of things that I wanted to know about the place, especially the older people. These are just some of the other means of transport that I found myself using in that time. Putting my bag on the back of mules, for example. Occasionally hitching rides on horses myself. Coracles. One of the most extraordinary places I visited is this island monastery in Yangdrot Lake, which can only be visited by coracle, and the coracle stays at the monastery, so it's really up to them whether they want you to come and visit or not. So that's in an age of motor transport and roads going everywhere, this is quite an exception. It's probably changed now. I don't know if they built a bridge or something. At that time, it was still preserved a certain atmosphere for being physically removed, from the grid. And then trucks. So I was. This is actually taken in Wangpo. One of the things that I witnessed at that time was, for example, there were many, as I said, the landscape was being changed so dramatically and so fast. This is me witnessing the clear felling of old growth forests in Wangpo, which happened during what had been going on since the 1960s, but it was going on even faster, probably with the enhanced transport infrastructure which had been built. Trucks driving this timber out to China, by night and day on their own. That's how I managed to hitch a ride down into Wangpo. Which is very beautiful, by the way. Yeah, so other things that I should just briefly mention about the guide. The maps were drawn by Ken Okuma, to whom I'm very grateful. I didn't want to do, digital style maps with all the technology that we have now. I preferred to do something, that would have been more familiar to Khyentse Wangpo. So Ken helped me to realize that by doing some very fine drawings. I'm sure I tested his patience to the extreme, but I'm quite happy with the maps. The photos, I was very lucky to have permission to use the collection of photos from the Sikkim Royal Palace, because the Queen Mother of Sikkim had undertaken a pilgrimage in central Tibet. She was from an aristocratic central Tibet family, married into Sikkim royalty. She traveled with many of her subjects, followers, in central Tibet in the mid-1930s, and took a camera and took photos of places of which there are no other photographic examples. And so I was given permission to use that, and you'll see many of those reproduced in the guide. And also Hugh Richardson, who I mentioned earlier, very kindly gave me permission to use all his photos, and so you'll see some of them reproduced there. I also managed to find quite a few, well, I don't want to exaggerate, but I found a few old guidebooks, rare pieces of literature about holy places, and this is a photo of I published them as a collection at the library here in Dharamsala. As one of the spin-offs of the project. Finally, I should, yeah. Finally, I should mention that none of this would have been possible without the Khyentse Foundation, who generously agreed to support the publication of the book in physical form. And finally of all, I suppose I should just say that this whole endeavor and the book itself is dedicated to that generation of people who I mentioned, who spent the last years of their lives trying to rebuild what was left of old Tibet, and most of whom are no longer with us now. So this is in their memory. So I'll stop there, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And very nice to realize also beyond the intellectual challenge, your physical challenge and adventures. Very beautiful to hear about that. I do have a question. When you spoke about how you think that it was Kongtrul that might have inspired Jamyang Khyentse to compose this biography, this article came to mind by Alexander Gardner, about the 25 power spaces of Kham. And I remember, I read this many years ago, but I vaguely remember him talking about the political reasoning behind it and the intentional exclusion of Gelupa sites when you look at these 25 places as a sort of, as an assertiveness of the Rima movement, which some say was somewhat against the Gelupas, if you follow me, how he purposely excluded Gelupa sites, emphasizing more Nyingmapa, Kajupa, etc. And I'm wondering if you think Khyentse might have had any somewhat, let's say, political intentions or trying to make a point, you knowing so well all the sort of inner...
Yes, political, yes. Anti-Gelupa, definitely not. Absolutely not. Khyentse makes it absolutely clear in all his writings about, especially about history and the categorization. But he was an ardent admirer of the Gelupa tradition, and he studied very seriously in the Gelupa tradition, and he spares no pains to praise the Gelupa tradition. And all of his teachers, however, were people from Kham and Amdo. And praise of the Gelupa tradition does not extend to admiration of the Gandhi Pochang and the three great monasteries in Lhasa.
Right.
But any scent, any whiff of discrimination against the Gelupa as a religious spiritual tradition, he would have angrily rejected. And this notion that somehow the Rime people are fighting the Gelupa or anti-Gelupa, should not really be entertained at the level of these kind of great masters, whatever other people may have thought. But the question of recognizing holy places in Kham, recognizing holy places is sort of by definition a political exercise. Part of what the Rime movement was doing when I said that the center of gravity had shifted from central Tibet to eastern Tibet, that involved also shifting the landscape. Right. When you make pilgrimage, as Khyentse did in central Tibet, so many of the places that you go to, especially the older ones, are conceived or characterized as replicas or representations of Indian holy places, right? And that's what gives them their sanctity, right? A holy cemetery or something will be called, the Tibetan Sitavana, for example, right? There are so many mountains which are supposed to have flown from India to Tibet, because India was the source of sanctity and was the source of religious Buddhist authenticity. So just having a Tibetan holy place is not such a big deal, right? If you can't claim an Indian antecedent for it, right? So it's the whole, and authenticity is extremely important consideration in traditional thinking. Right, so the Rime masters of Khyentse's time were doing something similar, in the sense that many of their holy places were regarded as representations or replicas of central Tibetan holy places. They were shifting the landscape in keeping with the shifting of the whole tradition and the whole center of gravity, making a new Buddhist paradise in an area which had previously been peripheral to the tradition. making it a new center. So this Khyentse wrote guides and prophecies and so on for many of these places in the style that I mentioned, very elaborate, very ornate, poetic, all of that, completely different from the guide. I wouldn't say he was inspired to write the guide. I would say he was kind of insisted to write the guide, and it was probably dictated to a scribe in about half an hour, jotted down. And just because of its unique and very practical value, it later became one of his best known works. I mean, that wouldn't have occurred to him at the time. Probably it's a sort of accident, not an accident, but it's a trajectory of history. That's the only work that many people know him by now. But it's absolutely uncharacteristic, and it wasn't conceived by him as something that he was just answering the question of probably of Kongtrul or some other disciple.
Right. Thank you very much. I see that Lewis has raised his hand in the chat. Lewis, please do unmute yourself. I think you can. Yeah, perfect.
Hello. Yeah, thanks very much for the really fascinating talk. What you said that this was quite a kind of paradigm shift in terms of how you do a neyik. Can you hear me? Is that okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think some of the inspiration might have been, or the sources that he was using? Do you get the sense that a lot of the information came from these karchak of individual kind of places, or was a lot of it inspired by vision or by his own reading?
I think it's not so much about the content; it's about the form and the presentation. So this is quite a difficult question to answer, because it's not so much that this was a conscious project of Khyentse and Kongtrul. It's more that this was a kind of zeitgeist, of Tibet post 18th century. So, for example, number of the really encyclopedic historical works that we're familiar with today were written in that period. Some of them were written by Khyentse's teachers, right? Dome Chenju, for example, was written by Dragon, this Labra incarnation. It was one of Khyentse's main Gelugpa teachers. The history of Shalu was written by one of his main Sakyapa teachers. Right, it's a voluminous work, including a long biography of Bhutan and the entire history, abbatial succession, everything as the monastery, history, everything. Shalu Lose Tenkyong, who was in his own right, although he wasn't a Kalpa, in his own right, a Rime master, was instrumental in recovering the Jamyang tradition in central Tibet during his life, persuading the Tashi Lumpo authorities to open the locks on the library at Jamyang and so on. Then many others. I mean, Jigme Lingpa's history of the Nyingma Gyumbum and the Nyingma tradition. Number of these really systematic, voluminous, and quite rationally conceived works of history started to be produced in Tibet from the 18th century onwards. And Khyentse Guru Tashi Chunjung is obviously the key example, very close to home. Guru Tashi came from a monastery just close to Khyentse's birthplace, and it's the main source that he used for the history of the Tama tradition, although he corrected it in a couple of places from his own memory, which is quite funny. But this is the zeitgeist. This is what was happening, and it's hard not to see this as a form of modernity, although it's also very hard to categorically characterize it as such, right? So the Rime presentation of their material, the very careful categorization and presentation is not alien to the Tibetan tradition, but the way they do it has a sort of lucidity, rationality, clarity, which makes it stand out from earlier literature. Maybe I could just put it like that.
Yeah. Do you think that has anything to do with the shift towards the East and possibly new exposure to other forms of kind of historiography or writing encyclopedias from kind of Chinese traditions?
There's no sense of that. None of these people were literate in Chinese.
Yeah.
Right. Despite having, geographical neighborly connections to some extent. I mean, the couple of instances mentioned with Amdo, more than China, really. So there's very little evidence for that, and what we have, one of the works that would be included in the category I just mentioned is the Gyanak Khyentse by Gompo Kyap, Mongolian scholar of the High Qing era. And we know that Khyentse was very impressed by this work because in the Degi edition of the Gyanak Khyentse, the colophon, it says that Jamyang Khyentse, organized and sponsored the printing of this work, for example. But it's a work written in Tibetan. He wasn't literate in Chinese, nor was Kongtrul, nor were any of these people, as far as we know.
Yeah, great. If I could ask one last question, apart from it would be great to get the source for the Khyentse Chökyi Lodrö travelogue, where that was published.
Oh, well, it's been published online on there's a Sadra collection of, I don't know if you're familiar. You can find it, and
Okay.
I don't have precise. The Sadra, Foundation has made a sort of website or something devoted to the works of the Khyentse tradition or something like that.
Okay, great. Okay,
So it's in there.
I'll dig it. Yeah,
it's in there, but I can provide it to you separately if you don't find it.
Okay, thanks very much.
Sure. Someone else has their hand up?
Yes.
Hi. Yeah, okay. Hi, Matthew. Thank you for your presentation. I would like to know if nowadays it's possible to make the trip from the guide.
No, basically it's not. Individual travel in central Tibet has basically been impossible since 2008, when there was an uprising and a massive securitization of the region. It's still possible as a foreign passport holder to visit Tibet, but under very, very stringent restrictions. And you need permits, to go to every place, and they don't give permits to go to unusual places. More probably a list of, less than 10 places that there may be, exceptions to that, but basically to try and to set out and individually visit hundreds of places, absolutely impossible. Things are a little bit easier outside the autonomous region. You might get away with slightly more liberal travel in Sichuan, Qinghai, etc. But in central Tibet, absolutely not.
Okay, thank you so much.
No.
If we don't have any more questions, Matthew, would you like to add anything else?
I think I'm done, unless there is more detail that anybody wants to go into.
I had a question, if that's okay, another one. How are these Nayig treated within the diaspora today? I mean, have you kind of worked with any of them? Because now, like you were just saying, it's so difficult to reach these places. Is it like another layer of this kind of Utsang was in some ways to the Eastern Tibetans? And can they use this in some ways to kind of re-envision the Tibet that they can't access so much anymore?
Are you talking about the diaspora, or are you talking about Eastern Tibet?
The diaspora.
Well, the diaspora is entirely academic, right? People have no access to their own country. So the most noticeable, reaction to the guide. I mean, the guide became extremely popular after the 1980s because one of the aspects of the liberalization in central Tibet was that pilgrimage was allowed, and that was very attractive to large numbers of Buddhist devotees, especially from Kham, also from Amdo. And they started coming in large numbers. And in fact, many of them are responsible themselves for starting reconstruction at the sites which are, are most sacred to their traditions, which are normally Nyingma Kagyu. They initiated it in many cases, lamas from Eastern Tibet and so on. But the guide was reproduced, printed in cheap booklet form by the Chinese government in many editions. In fact, I think each of them most of the provincial publishing houses did their own edition because it was such a popular thing. Because in that at that time, people could jump on a truck and reach Lhasa in a short period of time. It was a whole new ballgame, and it was a very popular thing to do. So in that age, which is through the late 1980s, 1990s into the early 2000s, it was a very popular and well-known work because of the extraordinary authority of the author, and because of the practical, usefulness of the short, portable, readable kind of work that it was, which is not typical of religious literature. So that's the main sort of pickup that we can notice in recent times.
Okay. So you don't get the sense of people being able to read it, even if they are not able to go on pilgrimage, as a way of kind of going in their minds if they can't go in reality, kind of thing.
I haven't heard that particularly.
Okay.
And it would need quite a lot of imagination because I don't know if you've seen the text of the guide, but it's very sparse. Right. It leaves a lot to the imagination. There's no description really in that. It's just a list.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Matthew.